right, thank you. Our final speaker, Ms. Mariko Peggs, is a doctoral candidate in African American Studies and African Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. She graduated cum laude with a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of California, Los Angeles, and later received her Master of Arts from UC Berkeley. Ms. Peggs' dissertation discusses the commercialization and practice of genealogy, how African American families make meaning from the stories of their enslaved ancestors, and how those stories impact family and individual identities. Her paper today is entitled 19th Century African American Women Pursuing Redress Along the Diagonal.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. So the title of my paper is the same.
You need to unmute,
Oh.
Mariko, sorry.
Oh, wait a minute. Oh, yes.
There you go.
There we go. I guess I was talking to myself there. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. The title of my paper is, yes, 19th Century African American Women Pursuing Redress Along the Diagonal, but the content is different. I will actually be talking about diagonality as a framework. And so I will begin. The goal, and this is a conceptual paper. The goal of this paper is to discuss the nature of Missouri and how what I term diagonality shapes the ways African American women, Missourian women, pursued redress. I define diagonality as the simultaneity of spatial and ideological factors that lead to instability and ambiguity for individuals within given temporal moments. In other words, diagonality is based on geographic and cultural contexts. For example, the physical spaces of the Missouri Territory determined where people settled, what crops or businesses they established, and how white people engaged with African Americans. In this way, because of their forced connection to the land, diagonality framed the boundaries that African American women navigated as they sought redress. Diagonality cuts across angles and breaks the rules of linearity to both create and restrict possibilities for oppressed Black women living along the ambiguous landscape of Missouri. The ambiguity of Missouri lies in its diverse values, beliefs, and practices, especially related to African American women and slavery. The culture of Missouri is unlike the North, unlike the South, and actually unlike other border states. The spectrum of division within Missouri ranged from staunch Confederate enslavers to anti-slavery unionists. European immigrants also added complexity to Missouri's ideological landscape. The most prominent groups, Irish and Germans, contributed to the cultural fabric of Missouri, and the latter, in many ways, because of their large population, helped the advancement of the abolition of slavery. Yet, white U.S.-born Missourian settlers and immigrants still found stability and home in their racist beliefs about the inferiority of African Americans. In this sense, even white abolitionists and anti-slavery advocates did not believe in the equality between Black and white people. Therefore, the terrain of Missouri required African American women to navigate spaces that were not always stable or defined. The women could expect to experience varying forms of treatment, from high levels of sympathy and support to extreme racial terror. Thus, diagonality challenges and destabilizes binary ideologies. The intersectionality of race, gender, and other identities are prominently factored into the experiences of 19th century African American women. But we miss the significance of geography and culture without a diagonal lens. Intersectionality and diagonality are similar frameworks that help us understand how and why African American women's experiences are shaped based on identities, culture, and spatial contexts. However, the two terms operate in different ways. Intersectionality refers to the interconnected and cumulative ways Black women experience oppressions, which begin with race and gender and can also include other identities like class, religion, sexuality, and age. Diagonality impacts the particular spaces women occupy based on temporality. As cultures evolve, people within that culture must adapt to both the local dynamics and societal norms of the time period. Both intersectionality and diagonality show how African American women's identities and geospatial factors impact their actions and experiences. Morality is the notion of behaving in a, quote, right or, quote, good manner for the well-being of humanity. However, with respect to African American women, white society's morals were inconsistent, which informed the women's attempts to make right the injustices done against them. I define redress for African American women as actions taken in an attempt to remedy material and immaterial losses based on a moral compass, rather than a legal basis, rooted in the knowledge of the unremediability of their loss. In other words, even though newly freed African American women took steps to remedy their grievances against, for example, former white enslavers or employers, the women, for the most part, understood that they could not be made whole legally or otherwise, yet they demanded redress anyway. African American women sought redress for different reasons and in different ways. The women's pursuit of remedies for rape or violence against them, the sale of kin, and unpaid or underpaid services are just some reasons they took action. Even after their emancipation, when enslaved African American women celebrated their freedom, they discovered that freedom did not equate to rights of equal redress. Put another way, freed African American women had de jure rather than de facto rights to redress. Some of the alternate routes women chose included stealing food from an employer who underpaid them or feigning illness to avoid providing labor to an employer who abused them. An examination of a formerly enslaved African American woman named Agnes Evans in an 1869 probate case helps to highlight yet another informal pathway. Agnes lived in the rural town of St. Clair, which was the mining region of Franklin County, Missouri. Agnes allegedly embezzled personal property from her deceased former enslaver, Fernando A. Evans. Diagonality shaped Agnes's possibilities and limitations. The distinctiveness of Missouri, relating to its location in the middle of the country, the groups of people that migrated there, and the original laws of the state, are factors that developed it as a small-scale farming and enslaving state. Unlike southern plantations, Missouri's enslaving households were predominantly small-scale, with 10 or less enslaved persons, and more often with 1 or 2. According to Diane Moody Burke, Missouri was primarily settled by farmers that migrated out of the Upper South from states like Kentucky and Tennessee, where small-scale farmers were unable to compete with large plantations. The intimacy of, quote, close proximity in which Black and white members of the household lived and worked sometimes led to improved material conditions, yet small-scale slavery exposed many others to the worst forms of abuse, end quote. The mining industry's economic expansion and the diverse groups of people, business people, and laborers that Agnes encountered while working for Fernando allowed her to observe and learn strategies to improve her socioeconomic status. The development of strong ties to her community and also enabled her to form close interpersonal relationships with her peers and benefit from white men and women as resources to assist her in business and her other endeavors. The crossing of a number of factors that create the diagonality of the space both limit and open up Agnes's possibilities. The forces of both intersectionality and diagonality resulted in the kinds of labor required of and available to Agnes. According to the probate record, she did both domestic and field labor. She worked in jobs historically reserved for women, like cooking, washing, and ironing, but also those dominated by men, such as hauling wood. Sojourner Truth's lived experiences embody the ideological fracture between society's purported ideals and the reality for Black versus white women. In her 1851 speech titled "Ain't I a Woman?", Truth proclaims, quote, "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles. And ain't I a woman? I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman?" End quote. Truth's critique of the racial disparities related to women emphasizes the contradictory nature of white supremacy, which compels African American women's actions toward alternate forms of redress. Drawing on Truth's observations, we can deduce that Agnes pursues redress based on her racial and gender/patriarchal lines. Agnes's testimony in the probate case of her former enslaver Fernando informs us that she was a witness to the 50-50 verbal contract between Fernando and Isaac Renfro, a formerly enslaved Black man. Her contribution led to a successful outcome for Isaac. Agnes was both a credible witness for Isaac on the one hand and criminalized as an embezzler on the other. I attribute her accepted duality as part of the small town's knowledge of each other's personalities and histories. This small town culture is part and parcel of diagonality's shaping of Agnes's experiences. The intersections of her race and gender operated to stereotype her as lazy, untrustworthy, and deviant, while diagonality worked through cultural traditions and ideologies that allowed some white citizens in the region to see Agnes's humanity. Because of the close proximity and living spaces of white and black people, each group could better see the humanity of the other. The Evans mine, owned by Fernando, employed Agnes after her emancipation. I assert that Agnes pursued redress by claiming approximately $632 worth of personal property from Fernando's estate after his death. She labored for many years, and this was her opportunity to take what her labor helped Fernando acquire. She also appeared to be more than just an employee to Fernando. There's no record of him having a wife or children. Consequently, while enslaved, Agnes was probably a concubine, and once freed, she likely managed the household. Agnes's story teaches us that space matters, which is why we need to include diagonality alongside intersectionality in our analysis of Black women's lived experiences. Agnes's actions in Missouri, documented in Fernando Evans' probate case, helps us see that if we only use an intersectional lens, we overlook the nuanced circumstances grounded in a geographic landscape. Missouri was a unique space that Agnes was able to utilize in ways that were impossible in other parts of the country. I'm not suggesting that other Black women in the 19th century did not seek redress like Agnes, but what is clear is that Agnes's efforts were captured by an archive that can be used to explain how a 19th century African American woman can be simultaneously credible and criminal in the eyes of the law. Therefore, it is imperative to consider the influence of time and geography and the ensuing culture that develops to better understand 19th century African American women pursuing redress. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you all. Our panelists raise a great many questions about the dynamic, fascinating, and often frustrating place that was Missouri in the mid-19th century. Their papers remind us that it was a place riven by social tensions, caught in the midst of sweeping legal and demographic change. Yet, although our scholars ground their work in specific geographic contexts, they raise more universal questions about the human experience. They ask us, what is justice? From whom can it be sought? And how shall it be secured? This morning's scholarship enriches our understanding of community, and not only the ties which bind, kinship, faith, commitment to shared values, a connection to place, but also the fissures which too often divide us. What's more, today's important work reminds us of the personal resonance and practical difficulties associated with historical inquiry. The task of uncovering the past is often encumbered by silences within the archives and an evidentiary record that is fragmented and tantalizingly incomplete. Yet history, as these papers demonstrate, is in us. It is us, and therefore we keep on digging. Scott Both's paper examines how the Latter-day Saints searched for redress in the founding documents of the United States as they faced persecution in Missouri in the 1830s. I'll admit that personal ties made me especially curious about the first two papers because my mom was born and raised in Caldwell County. I appreciate this paper's careful analysis of Joseph Smith's understanding of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of 1787, as well as James Madison's belief in Federalist 10 that oppressed minorities could someday turn to the general government to hear their grievances. There are issues here which I was curious to hear more about, but I understand that there's only so much you can fit into a conference paper. But these include the influence of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause upon the developing civic culture of the Latter-day Saints, which were a uniquely American congregation. I was especially fascinated by the issue of the 14th Amendment and the ways in which its protections had been anticipated, because the 14th truly is this bright line that is drawn across our constitutional history. I also wondered how the hardships faced by the Latter-day Saints, both in Missouri and then in Nauvoo, Illinois, plus the federal government's limited response to each, I wondered how those might have influenced their expectations of redress from the federal government. Professor Alford's presentation reminds us of the peculiar challenge and satisfaction of investigating a tightly focused query, which in this case was Joseph Smith's court-martial legal. The nuanced consideration of the many factors at play in this proceeding show us how the pursuit of justice can sometimes travel paths that are poorly marked and left to the judgment of individuals exercising a wide degree of latitude. The ambiguity of this situation, a controversial civilian figure thrust into a military proceeding at a time of great turmoil and in the dead of night, it's the stuff of rich analysis, and I find Dr. Alford's interpretation compelling. I'm curious about what lessons he might draw from this small example about the larger relationship between civilian and military authority. Throughout our history, civilian control of military policy has been a bedrock principle of our system, yet 1838 comes at an interesting moment. We're looking at half a century after the Revolution, but yet, as you note, years before the Civil War, and the Lieber Code will begin